There is increasing confusion about the war in Ukraine. What happens to the anticipated counteroffensive? What is Kyiv's current strategy? And are the recent drone attacks on Moscow, Krasnodar and Belgorod part of that counteroffensive? Or is Kyiv trying to create a military distraction and unsettle the Russian public? Or is there something else behind it? In any case, the Russian leadership is threatening retaliation and continuing to use drones and missiles also against Kyiv, where civilians are still dying. We look at the constantly shifting battlefield and ask, are those drone attacks on Russia part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive? Welcome to The Point. I'm pleased to introduce today's panel. That's Gustav Gressel, military expert at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Alexei Yusupov, head of the Russia department of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation think tank. And my Ukrainian colleague Ksenia Polska from Deutsche Welle's studio in Brussels. A warm welcome to all of you. Gustav, let me start with you. Let's just look at the most recent developments there. Russia has increased its drone attacks in recent days, even during the day. Why is that happening?
Ammunition is available. We see from the wreckages of these missiles that they are produced fairly recently. So basically, missiles are fired as they leave the factory. Russia had a slump in production because of sanctions, because of interruption of supply chains. But these interruptions only hold temporarily. So there are substitution programs to use Chinese electronics instead of Western ones. There are smuggling programs to kind of buy these subcomponents and special materials through third countries and brass plate enterprises.
To avoid the
being
sanctions.
Yes, to avoid being sanctioned, and sort of, at least in this part of Russia's arms industry, sort of the production curve is again pointing upwards. So they, of course, they have more ammunition to fire, and that's what they use.
Ksenia, Ukraine seems to defend quite well against these attacks. They shoot down a lot of those cruise missiles. But how much of that success is owed to Western weapon systems?
Well, actually, most of it, because without it, we would see much more deaths, we would see much more casualties, we would see so much more destruction. Just remember that the first such defense system, I think, got into Ukraine in October last year. So what were we seeing before that? There were lots more, there were dozens of people dying after each attack. It was much more dangerous. Now, from the psychological point of view as well, Ukrainians feel that they are much more protected every time they say thank you to our defenders, but also thank you to the new defense systems. It is quite obvious that it had made a huge change in, if we can call it, the quality of life of Ukrainians, but at least they don't have to fear immediate death.
Alexei, there weren't only drone attacks by Russia and attacks on Kyiv, but there were also drone attacks by Ukraine on Russian territory. What's behind that strategically? What do you think?
Well, it's a good question, because they're quite silent for obvious reasons about what exactly was the aim, and we have to see that there are different logics behind it. I think the attacks that have happened in Moscow, although it's not completely clear if the drone crashed on purpose, if they were armed with explosives, it's a bit unclear, and the Russian propaganda, of course, frames all of them as terrorist attacks. It suits the narrative. But in general, this is, for me, more a psychological part of this counteroffensive, to show that the reach of a potential strike is quite extensive. And also, you have to imagine Moscow is not a border city, so they are flying over quite some area with other people living in it. And to be honest, Moscow in itself is defensible and defensed. But the general idea that, it's not a unilateral shooting and being shot at. That's important, although I would say that the results, the psychological, the political results of the Moscow attacks are mostly to be seen that the Kremlin is deciding how to react properly. That's unclear. And the people are getting nervous, the Russians, because they also don't know what the Kremlin will decide. It's not about the immediate danger of continuous attacks, it's the uncertainty of it, and that's helpful. This is a different story from the attacks in the border areas where there are Ukrainian drones and artillery and so on, because this is actually an auxiliary form of a counteroffensive.
Now, Gustav, the Kremlin talked, you just mentioned it, the possible reaction. The Kremlin talked about the hardest possible retaliation to those attacks. What does that mean?
Basically nothing, because they will continue their strikes as they would continue without those. There is no second guards wonder army living in Wonderland, training with wonder weapons that wonderfully will change the course of the war for Putin. The Russian military already is quite stretched. Of course, there have to be the rhetoric that air defense has to work superbly, that there will be retaliation, etc. But that's part of the psychology. Russia has exhausted a lot of its military means. It is playing a long war game now, and that also for Russia, of course, means that during the course of the long war, it will be hit one or the other time.
Now, the longer this war, the higher, of course, the death toll gets, especially, of course, among the soldiers fighting this war. Nobody knows the exact numbers, but according to US intelligence estimates, the Ukrainian side alone has suffered about 20,000 deaths and far more than 100,000 injured soldiers so far. But morale remains high. And a warning, some viewers may find the images in our next report upsetting.
They work almost around the clock and save anyone they can. Severely injured soldiers transported from the front end up in this military hospital in Kyiv. We try to save these limbs first, but sometimes we have to amputate. It's especially difficult on young people who suffer from war trauma. This soldier just about managed to survive, but he lost his leg. And he has to learn to live without his forearm. This paratrooper was seriously injured on the very second day of the Russian invasion. Now he wants to return to the front.
I was afraid because the town where I spent my whole childhood was on fire and being destroyed.
How long can the Ukrainian soldiers hold out against the Russians, who outnumber them?
Hard to bear those images. Alexei, that as we just saw, the fighting spirit of these Ukrainian soldiers seems largely unbroken. But will, in the end, sheer numbers tip the balance in Putin's favor, you think?
It's more the fact that Russia is now in the strategic defense. They don't need to actually advance. And this is actually a shift as opposed to last year when the strategy was to subdue and actually conquer and destroy Ukraine. Now, well, you see, the Russian forces are overstretched and exhausted, but they mostly need to regroup and hold the line. And as Gustav Krasnodar mentioned, the whole idea that Russia can injure Ukraine for a very, very, very long time, that's the strategy. So the momentum is often cited, is there, and the question is if the counteroffensive will put Ukraine in a position to seize the momentum. A momentum is a very strange word to use, but it consists of different things. Yeah. And at the moment, it's unclear. So the longer the counteroffensive is not commencing in a visible way, and it's clear it's not a decision day scenario, but still, the longer it is getting more comfortable for Russia to just sit it out. So that's actually not about the numbers and the motivation by itself, but it's also about the timing. And this links back to supplies, ammunition, Western support, and so on. Time is not working for Ukraine at the moment.
Now, talking about how time is working not for Ukraine, how much more losses, how much more suffering, as we've just seen, can Ukraine take?
Ukraine has no choice and Ukrainians have no choice, and this is what everybody keeps repeating. We have to hang on, we have to hold on and survive, and try to make the most out of it. People in the front line, people away from the front line, people in the occupied areas. They all have different problems now, but at the same time, they are all trying to carry on, they're all trying to survive and bring Ukrainian victory closer. So, of course, they're living under enormous stress. They constantly experience a cocktail of emotions, which is fear, which is joy when they may live maybe one more day or one more month or maybe their whole life because the missile hit a neighbor's house and not theirs, you know, and then there's hope that this would end soon because there's another weapon system coming from the West which could change the situation in the battlefield. And then there's another attack and there's fear again and stress because of the unknown and because there's very limited influence, even though as a Ukrainian you send your money to help the army or to support civil initiatives, but there's very limited influence a citizen can have on the situation.
Absolutely. Gustav, Ukraine's military leadership said they were ready for the counteroffensive. We've heard that for a long time. We're waiting for this counteroffensive. What are the credible signs that we need to look out for that the counteroffensive is going to happen?
Well, we are in the preparatory phase, so at the time...
We still are.
We still are. I think the intensive attacks on command and control posts in Ukraine South are something to watch out for, rather an indication that the ground offensive might commence rather sooner, because these are attacks that basically decimate the local Russian armed forces groupings to react. These command posts will be rebuilt in a couple of days or weeks. So if you want to use the momentum you build with the Storm Shadow strikes, be quicker. The other thing is, on timelines, a lot about this offensive is logistics. To get the ammunition, but also to get it into Ukraine, to disperse it, to prepare it, etc. Logistic preparations are extensive because we're talking about a very large mass of soldiers, tanks, equipment that will be part of that offensive. And that's not very trivial, and hence, but it's also very difficult for us to look into these preparations because the Ukrainians kept them as secret as can be, but they will, by and large, determine the timeline.
So, what do you think? What's the likelihood that we see the counteroffensive proper to start within the next 4 weeks?
The likelihood seems to be very good. As I said, these strikes in the south indicate that that momentum is to be built rather sooner. Of course, we may question how big will it be. Will there be smaller offensives, or will Ukrainians achieve a breakthrough that enables them to exploit them into bigger gains? That verdict is still out there. Of course, there are good chances for Ukraine to have a major breakthrough, but in military there are always chances. You're never secure whether a plan might work or not, because it's a very complicated affair.
Ksenia, let me just put the same question to you. I mean, you have your feelers into the country that is under attack there. What's the feeling inside of Ukraine about this counteroffensive?
People are hoping that it would commence soon, and people are hoping that it would bring the victory closer. Victory meaning liberating the occupied territories by Russia. And people, of course, they would like to believe that it's coming very soon. They are optimistic because, as I said, sometimes hope is the only thing they have, and sometimes their principles is the only thing they have. They don't want this bad peace, as they say. They don't want just, for this to stop, but to be frozen, as is in this status quo.
That's quite possible, right?
It is. Well, nobody knows what's going to happen really, but Ukrainians, according to statistics and according to what people I know say, they don't want this kind of scenario to happen. They really want to recover all the territory, and they want Russia out of the country, because anything Russian right now is extremely irritating and causing more. Every time it's more and more rage.
This is very interesting that you mentioned this. So let me put this to you. Is it likely that there will be a compromise? I mean, we've just heard that most Ukrainians want to fight it through to the end until the Russians are out of the country.
Let's chew it through. What does it mean to fight it through the end? There is the language saying the moment the last Russian soldier leaves the legal territory of Ukraine, there is a military victory. But again, let's see that most of aggression and violence which is inflicted at the moment to Ukrainian cities are rocket strikes and drones. This will not happen by the latest soldier just leaving Ukraine. It doesn't secure this. So this is first. Second,
but maybe Ukraine would have the planes by that time. The fighter jets, which it's waiting for.
You're bringing, yes. So the question is, this is one. Second is, a military success, how does it translate into political change? There is a theory of change saying, look, the Ukrainian offensive, if it's successful, means some kind of a military humiliation for the Russian side. Military humiliation could be imagined in terms of collapse of the front lines, or maybe there is a large number of people encircled. So something which ignites a disruptive moment inside the Russian state apparatus. I'm very skeptical about this because I see high capacities of the Kremlin to manage any kind of tactical military defeat. Even if we would agree that this is a defeat, this doesn't necessarily translate into political turmoil. This is the second thing. And the third thing is that in order to maintain Ukrainian security outside of NATO, you would need a much higher sustained level of supplies. And Gustav Krasel again mentioned, it's about ammunition, it's about fuel, it's about training, it's about repair bases and so on, over a continued period of time, years. I'm not quite sure is the European Union we're there yet. There is this catch-22 problem. Everyone expects wonders from the Ukrainian offensive on the European side in order to trigger a conversation about how we're going to do this for the next 10 years. And somewhere inside of this, there might be a time for a political process, but this is what the expectation is.
They've already seen wonders, because let's remember the talks about how Ukraine would fall in 3 days, you know, and it's my favorite example. It was a wonder because, as you say, Russia was, you know, Russia knew very well what they were doing. Ukraine was standing there alone. No foreign soldier would help ever on the Ukrainian territory. Ukraine didn't have all these weapons that it has now.
I agree, but the thing is, Russia was on the offense and now Russia is on the defense.
Yeah.
So it takes a completely different momentum and effort to change this situation. So the comparison is correct in terms that Ukraine has, and Ukrainian military and the people have performed absolutely amazingly beyond any expectations. But the thing is that even if this counteroffensive is extremely successful, it doesn't necessarily end the war at this very moment.
It's true. It might, but it might change it. And I think this is the most realistic that we can expect.
Let me pick this up, Gustav.
There is a problem, sort of, I see in Western strategy. We have this rhetoric, as long as it takes, a last soldier has to leave. But there's a huge delta between the rhetoric and the actual supply Ukraine gets. Now, of course, everybody understands that there is now the counteroffensive, and for a lot of European countries, this is kind of a trial balloon. They hope for a settlement to happen thereafter. Like, yeah, this would be embarrassing for Putin. Wouldn't an embarrassing defeat make him negotiate? What if not? The problem is, as we've seen with this counteroffensive, you know, we had the talks basically since last autumn about the supply of certain weapon systems. Let's remember the Leopard 2 debate. It takes months to bring them into Ukraine. It takes months to prepare them for shipment, etc. Now everybody's basically waiting for the counteroffensive, and it will happen over the summer. Ukraine has time over the summer to make good in territory. And then in autumn, then what? Where is our preparation for the next shipment? Where is our defense industrial strategy to relieve equipment that Ukraine would need, and that sort of we can replace it in Europe? It's not there. Everybody's like sitting there saying, yeah, we'll watch what is going on. And then in autumn is, oh my God, we should have. And we're losing time again. And then basically we have these operative pauses that go over the winter, etc. And Moscow is fine with that. As by now, basically, Putin has realized he will not win the war by the merits of his own glorious army, but by the hope of that Donald Trump, maybe if he returns in 2024, by political divisions in the West, he may be presented with a victory in Ukraine because of sort of Western supply drying out. So he's playing for time and we are not undercutting his confidence in the play for time by what we're doing, unfortunately.
It takes too long, it's true, because if the European Union says, let's create this ASAP, so act in support of the ammunition production, let's vote for it, let's have this three-phase plan where we give Ukraine the ammunition that we have, then reimburse the countries, then we change our contracts, then we produce more. Even if it's done at the fastest, pace that the European Union can go, it's still too slow for Ukraine. And there, of course, you're right. And there I'm saying Putin knew very well what he was doing. So anything that the EU does or the community of 50-plus states does in order to militarily support Ukraine shows great unity, shows great support, but still, unfortunately, and Ukraine says that as well. They admit it. It's not fast enough, and it's simply not enough. They're happy about any kind of help. They are expecting to get the fighter jets now, which were considered taboo, actually, some time ago.
For a long time.
Every taboo so far has been out-negotiated. But still, anything in terms of looking at the suffering of Ukrainians, of lost lives, of how fast it should actually, the dynamics of the war, anything right now that we're seeing is too slow.
Can I just point towards it might sound a bit heretical, but let's spare a thought for the average Russians in the areas that are now getting attacked. What's the mood there, you think?
The mood, the areas at the border on the Russian side have been witnessing a war creeping into their actual cities for a long time now. It's not like now there is a watershed moment.
For a year almost.
Yes,
almost
almost for a year. There have been strikes and struggles and skirmishes, it's incursions. So the war is a reality there. And there's a big difference between the population of the big cities, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, because they feel that they're very distant, both from Ukrainian suffering, but also from the suffering of their own compatriots at the border. So for them now, the uncertainty is palpable. It's just there. There is a lot of anger about local authorities, about border troops, and this is why the government and the military will need to react, and this works. So militarily speaking, reinforcing your border means that you are taking away forces which are used for the aggression. This is a good strategy. In terms of day-to-day mood, people don't really think about the politics of it. So they see kids have to be evacuated, some houses are attacked, there is a need to go back into areas which have been curfewed to check on your houses and so on. The reality is there, and I think the lesson here is that even if you think you're a political mastermind, you can't put a war into a box and to say this is a special military operation and this is war and this is peace, and I will be able to contain it. What Russia is witnessing right now is that you cannot hold a war on a leash. It takes its space and it goes and extends by itself. This is what's happening.
Let me pick this up. You cannot keep a war on a leash. If we zoom out a bit and talk about Belarus and what's happened there, it's neighboring both Russia and Ukraine. And its President Lukashenko said recently that Russian nuclear weapons are now stationed in Belarus. Is that to be taken seriously? And what difference does it make?
It makes no difference in military terms. I think it makes a lot of difference in political terms, as Lukashenko sees that as an insurance policy for his personal life. He wants to have a guarantee that Russia will fight for him. And of course, if there are Russian nuclear weapons on the ground in Belarus, it's one incentive more for Putin to say we will not take chances in any form of unrest. We will have to keep Lukashenko in place. There's actually a Russian nuclear storage site just behind the border of Belarus. So any nuclear, and there were nuclear sharing, so-called nuclear sharing agreements between the Belarusian armed forces and the Russian armed forces even before that, because in the context of the Union state, even according to pre-war military doctrine and Russian documents, sort of Belarus would be defended also by nuclear means.
The Union state is a very weird combination of the two state entities, which they've had for a decade.
Yes, and it's a very weird excuse for both parties to do basically whatever they
want. Yeah.
Whatever
There's
they like.
no accountability, and we perceive right now, the more it goes on, the more we perceive Belarus as just an extension of Russian, policies and politics.
Are Ukrainians worried about Belarus getting drawn into this?
Well, of course, Ukrainians are worried. Ukrainians basically are worried. But the thing is, there is nothing new that one can expect from Lukashenko. So it's quite predictable what's going to happen. Nobody is expecting that Lukashenko would suddenly change his mind or say to Putin no, or drift towards Europe. It's all quite clear.
Lots more to discuss. Our time is up. Unfortunately, that's it for this edition of To the Point. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And do join the conversation. If you happen to watch us on YouTube, leave your comments and thoughts down below. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Gerhard Elfers from my panel here in the studio and the team. Thanks for watching.